Hi, I'm Ian.
And I'm Jason.
And this is Ghosts and Bears, the only podcast where we bring you the actual ghost stories
With the actual history.
in the actual place. It's that time of year again. It's our special Christmas episode with ghosts from the Victorian era, when they actually told ghost stories at Christmas. So pull up a chair, get a little closer to the fire. There's less darkness as the closer you get to the light. And we're going to share with you some Victorian Christmas tales coming up on Ghosts and Bears. Our first story this evening is called The Vicar's Ghost by Lucy Farmer, and it was published in 1872. Chapter 1, A Mysterious Visitor. It was a half promise to my aunt, Mrs. Jacka, of Porthmurray, that I wouldn't relate the incidents of the scare we had at the vicarage until the trouble had blown over. But as the whole business is now settled and done with, I feel released from my engagement and may explain the awful mystery. Folks down Porthmurray way tried to laugh us out of countenance, but Aunt Martha, whose married name is Jacka, a terribly suggestive name of donkeys, and how they never had any children, is easy to account for. Aunt Jacka told me the whole story, and it came true, almost in my very face. Andrew Jacka, I nearly put 2 more letters on his name, was, when alive, the gardener at the vicarage when I spent last Christmas tide with little Charlie, our eldest, in Cornwall. The place is very pretty, in a valley near the sea. The church is quite a show building, and the tower is built perpendicular, as they call it there. And of course, anyone can see that. It's no wonder. If it was horizontal, now there would be something remarkable in it. We reached the lodge, which Mrs. Jacka, my aunt, still inhabits, and found a hearty welcome, a Christmas welcome, I may call it, and truly so. There were all kinds of hollies and ivies and red berries galore, a delicious smell of mincemeat and apples, quite appetizing, and a tea table spread out in a way which made me imagine that my late uncle was not so deserving of those 2 extra letters as I had fancied. He couldn't have been that kind and have left his widow so comfortable and not even black for him. We were early at tea after our journey, and were just gossiping when a knock came to the door, and little Charlie ran to open it. He ran back quick enough, looking scared a bit, and saying, "Mammy, it's a man at the door, a clergyman." "Well, he won't eat you, child," cried my aunt quick-like. "Don't be a goose." I didn't quite like her manner of speaking to the boy, though, having no children of her own, I could excuse her. But she rose up and went to the door in the dusk. She hadn't gone long when she came back with a red face ruffling like a turkey cock, making all allowances for genders, and without a word catches little Charlie a slap on the shoulder blade. "Here, Aunt Martha, what is this?" I cried. "What's Charlie done? I won't have him beat by anyone except his father, so there." "A bit of a brat to invent such untruths," she exclaimed. "If he was my child, I'd pound him." "Well, he isn't your child, Aunt, and as you never had one, you can't be expected to understand." "Wasn't there anyone there, dear?" I said to him as he ran to my side. "Yes, Mammy," he whispered. "I saw him." "A man, Charlie?" "Yes, a clergyman. A tall man with a red face like hers. It's the truth." He pointed to Mrs. Jacka, who didn't much relish the reference. "I'm sure the child did see the man, Aunt," said I. "He wouldn't tell a falsehood, would you, Charlie?" "I saw him," said the lad firmly. "He had a whip in his hands and spurs, golden spurs on his boots." "Mercy on us!" screamed my Aunt Martha. "He's come! Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear!" She began to rock herself backwards and forwards like a seesaw, her apron thrown over her head and groaning all the time as if in pain, a hee-haw kind of complaint, which came from her husband's side, perhaps, most likely. I didn't heed her greatly, for after her behavior to the boy, I didn't care very much about her fright, though I will not deny it, I was curious to find out the cause. Mind, it was rather fearsome. We 2 lone women in the lodge beside the wood of a darkening winter evening well on towards Christmas, the 19th of December it was, no one nearer than the vicarage up the long avenue, and a ghostly, creepy feeling in the rustling trees. Oh, it was creepy. After a while, as the fire burned up more cheerful and I had made little Charlie shut the door, Aunt Martha took her apron off her head and looked round. "Come here," she said, looking at Charlie. He wouldn't stir. She called him again. I won't hurt you, little silly, continued my aunt. Come here, I want you. Go, Charlie. Auntie won't hit you again, I'll be bound, says I, firm-like. She looked at me steadily as if scenting the battle afar off, but there was no fright. I didn't mean to hurt you, child, said she, patting Charlie's cheek in quite a motherly way. Here's sixpence for a Christmas box in advance. It wasn't your fault, child. I'm sorry I touched you. Kiss Auntie, Charlie. She has made you a nice present. There's a boy. Well, Aunt, what's happened, said I. Don't ask me, Lucy. I can't tell you. It's too dreadful anyway, she whispered. Of course, I knew quite well that this was only put off. A little pressing only was wanted, but I wasn't going to press her, so I changed the subject to something else. To my great surprise, she went on quietly along the new track and never breathed a syllable about the queer visitor as long as Charlie sat up. It was a clear, cold, moonlit night. As I tucked Charlie up in the little bed in my room, I could see the moon shining, and when I put the candle out, the room was quite light. Charlie promised to go to sleep, and so I left him, just closing the door so that we might hear him if he called out. I found Aunt Martha in the sitting room, knitting. As I came in, she put her needles down in her lap and looked at me steadily over her tortoiseshell spectacles. Well, Lucy? Well, Aunt, what's the matter? Isn't it terrible? Ain't you afraid? Afraid of what, Aunt? I cried in surprise. What's terrible? Why, that man. Why? Who is he? Does he live here? Live here? Lucy, listen. I am counted a sensible woman, isn't it so? I said I had heard as much from her before. What then? Lucy Farmer, mark my words, ponder and digest them. That was no living man whom your Charlie saw, and who we couldn't see. It was a spirit. I flopped down into a chair, all of a heap, as Aunt took up her needles, and after a look around the room began working again when her face turned to the door. She was glancing up now and then as if she expected something or somebody. A spirit? A ghost? You don't mean it. Say you're only playing Christmas on me, Aunt Martha, I said at last. I wish I could, Lucy, but I am sure from your child's description of the man that it's the old vicar. What? The dead vicar? Yes, the one what was drowned. He can't rest in his grave, or I should say he can't rest in the sea, because he wasn't buried. Did he fall in the sea then, I asked. He jumped in, whispered my aunt as she glanced fearful-like around the room. He was riding out from here one winter's day. It was the 19th of December, 88 years ago to a day, and this afternoon. Well, said I, she paused. He was going over to the nunnery yonder, continued my aunt, putting down her needles again, and wanted to go by the way of the beach. He was mounted on his black horse, Neff, a fine, sensible beast, and the vicar rode him at the cliff. Mercy on us, go on, Aunt. But the horse wouldn't jump the cliff, and the vicar, heaven forbid him, swore he'd go no other way. He whipped and spurred the animal, but it wouldn't budge. At last the vicar got in a towering passion. He dismounted, gave his horse a cut with the whip, took off his gilt spurs, put them in his tail pocket, and swearing he would go his own way, leapt down from the cliff. Was he killed? Dead as mutton, replied Aunt Martha. He sometimes appears, spurs in hand, sometimes booted and spurred, ready to mount his horse again. Many have seen him, and something always happens after he's been seen. We ought to tell the vicar, for something will surely happen before Christmas, Lucy. I was silent. The idea of walking up the avenue at that time of the evening while a ghost was haunting the place was awful. Besides, Charlie couldn't be left alone in the lodge, and I said so. Aunt Martha made no reply. Has the ghost ever appeared before? I asked. After a pause of silence, which was almost more dreadful than anything. Yes, she replied in a low voice. He has come 3 times, and every time something has happened. Once the church was robbed, and there has never been a sacrilege here afore nor since. The next time, young Filion, a brave lad of 11, was killed in the lane yonder by some most mysterious means in the storm, for a tempest always accompanies the appearance. And the last time the manor house was burgled, as Captain French called it. Robbed, he meant. Well, Aunt, we can't go up to the vicarage tonight, I said. If the storm should come on, we might be drenched, and I'm sure I would die if we met the ghost. Hush, said my aunt suddenly. Listen, don't you hear something? I listened with all my ears, and after a minute I fancied I could distinguish a moaning sound which rose and fell in a curious dull roar. But in the quieter intervals we could distinctly hear the clatter of a horse's feet. The sound came nearer and nearer. The animal was galloping like mad. No one could have ridden at such a pace, I should say, on such a night along the country road. My aunt made a dart at me and caught me by the arm. Lucy, we're dead to a certainty. This is Neff, the galloping horse, the red vicar's horse. Listen. We stood up, close together, trembling like aspens. The noise came nearer and passed in a few seconds. As it died away in the distance, I went to the casement and threw it open. The murmuring sound was quite audible. It is the sea, whispered my aunt. The storm is brewing. Shut the window, Lucy, I bid you. I shut it and sat down. And then after a spell of thinking, I said, Aunt Martha, I don't believe that horses have ghosts. And even so, they wouldn't make that clatter. Perhaps we've been mistaken after all. Rubbish, she replied. I must say, Lucy, I am surprised. I thought you had more sense. With this remark, the clock was striking 9. Being a full half-hour slow, my aunt took up a candlestick from the little sideboard and walked away without even bidding me good night. Cornish manners, perhaps, I muttered to myself. But Cornish or not, no one shall make me believe in the phantoms of dead horses rushing about country roads before 12 o'clock at night, anyway. But we hadn't done with ghosts yet. Chapter 2. The Man on Horseback. In the morning, the wind was blowing like mad. The trees were all bending in the direction away from the sea, and the roar of the wind in the branches added to the loud murmur of the waves on the beach made up a most alarming noise to one not accustomed to ghostly storms. There wasn't much rain, not heavy rain, but it made up for it in thickness and drifted in like smoke and steam, wetting everything in a second, and it tasted of salt. But notwithstanding the weather, Aunt and I determined to go up to the vicarage and warn the vicar about the ghost of his forerunner. There's something going to happen, my aunt kept saying, until at last I began to wish that something would happen to her tongue for a while. We struggled through the avenue facing the seaway against the wind, and in about 10 minutes we came in sight of the house among the bare trees, which were bending and tossing and complaining about the way in which the wind was treating them. We went boldly up to the side door, round the laurel and hydrangea bushes, and inquired for the vicar. The young girl who came to the door told us we couldn't see him. He was very busy packing up and would be off to London in the afternoon. Going to London? Exclaimed my aunt. Never! Why, who's to christen Mary Hadwin's child the day after tomorrow, and all arranged special? I'm sure I don't know, replied the girl. He told me this morning that he wasn't to be disturbed when I knocked on his door. Mrs. Mumbles has a holiday, and George, the groom, is off after the mare. Master goes at 4 o'clock. A nice time to go riding about Cornish roads, I thought. Which way is he going up to London, I asked. But bless ye, the girl didn't know. Why, if it had been me, I would have found out all about it in no time. She hadn't been long at the vicarage, I suppose. She was pert enough anyway, but prettier than any widower should have had in his house, in my opinion. Rubbish, said my aunt afterwards. And him an old man over 60. And a real old gentleman, too. Rubbish, Lucy. Rubbish or not, I didn't like the girl and said so. But as we couldn't see the vicar and weren't likely to, he being engaged in packing up, we had to go home again, driven up by the avenue by the wind, and continually having to turn around and face it because of its interference with our skirts. A regular bother on a windy day, and luckily we were private. What did that pert young woman say about the groom and the mare, Aunt? Says I, as we turned away home. George has gone after it somewhere. I wonder where. What will the vicar do without it? He has only the one animal. And, said I, stopping and turning round to the wind, listen to me. Don't you remember what we heard a runaway animal last night, pounding down the road in a terrible way? Perhaps the vicar's mare was frightened, and ran away when the ghost of the other horse had come into the stable. My aunt shook her head, and then settled her bonnet and her hair, being flustered. Lucy, my dear, mark my words. There's a great danger hanging over this place. A magpie darted out of our copse this morning, and the chimney smoked, which is sure signs. Mercy on us. Listen to the wind. There will be wrecks tonight, and a spring tide too. Come home. We struggled on and didn't dare to put our noses outside the cottage all day, You never saw anything like that storm. The wind tore up the trees and smashed branches. Birds were dashed to pieces on the perpendicular tower of the church. And jackdaws were killed in the very roof, found dead in the gutters on the next Sunday. The swish of the rain and the clouds of spray which were swept over the cliff you'd hardly believe. Great masses of white stuff coming up the hill, like birds, people told me the next day when we were all on the run because of the vicar. I myself saw lumps of foam lying in the fields. Little Charlie was afraid of the roaring in the chimney, and we were glad enough, I can tell you, when one of the keepers came in about 6 o'clock to see how we were. We trembled a bit when we told him about the ghost. "We'll keep a lookout tonight," he said, as he went away to the village, buffeted by the wind and regularly blown around the corner. "Why will they keep a lookout, Aunt?" I asked. "Because of the vicar's ghost," she replied. "It is sure to appear in the church tonight. At least it is said to come there and walk. A dim light, like a corpse candle, is to be seen by those who have the courage to go out. You'll hear the people presently." "I've never seen a ghost," I began. "You don't mean that you think of going out to look for it?" shouted Aunt, staring at me as if I had 7 heads. "Well, if others go, why shouldn't I? Nothing from the next world can harm us," I said. "Can't it?" she retorted with a sniff. "An appearance killed poor young Fillion, and he 11 years old. He was out in the storm, Aunt, wasn't he?" "Well, I suppose he was. Would the storm crush his skull in and lay him by the roadside a tangled corpse? No wind as ever blew could punch in people's skulls. Don't tell me. There's true, real danger out tonight. It's terrible, so it is." Of course, I said no more. The storm seemed abating, and about 10 o'clock we were both thinking of going to bed when a quick knocking was heard at the door. We sat still as mice and looked at each other. My aunt's face was the color of tallow, and I dare say mine wasn't much better. I couldn't stir an inch to save my life. The ghost had come again. "It's there," gasped my aunt. "Mercy on us, pray, Lucy." If you'll credit me, I couldn't. I could do no more than repeat a prayer that minute, though we were 6 at my finger ends, and all the creed on the tip of my tongue. No use. I couldn't speak, and the knocking continued. Suddenly my aunt whispered, "Send the boy. It won't hurt him." Send Charlie, in his nightdress too, to meet a wandering ghost of a suicided person? Not I. You wouldn't catch me sacrificing an innocent lamb like him to the evil one. I rose up then myself, and with a quaking at my heart and a quaver in my voice, called out, "Who's there?" "It's me, Robinson," replied the keeper. "I've heard a rumor there's something up at the vicarage, and I've come down to see after it." My aunt, by this time, was behind me, and opened the door without a blush, saying, "Come in, Mr. Robinson. Whatever is it? The ghost? We thought it must be you." "Oh, no, ma'am, not the ghost. Phyllis, our neighbor's lass, has come down with the cream, and the story is there's no one in the house, and there's a light in the church moving about." "Robbers!" I exclaimed. "Ghosts!" cried my aunt. "I knew it." "Well, it's a queer thing, and we're going to go see about it. The girl's gone with the master, they do say." "What girl?" shrieked Aunt Martha. "Not the pert hussy up at the house, surely," said I. "That's it," he said, nodding. "Susan has bolted, and someone has reported she was seen with master on the coast road this afternoon." "The old goose!" I cried. "What did I tell you, Aunt Martha? I took that girl's measure pretty quick." "Well, nothing will persuade me that the vicar has gone with her outside the pass of duty. No, Lucy, farmer, vicar's a clergyman, and ghosts from the churchyard wouldn't persuade me otherwise. Besides, who'd go along the beach road such a night as this?" "It ain't so out of the way bad now," remarked Robinson. "I'm going down." "I'll go with you," said I. "Well, I ain't going to be left like an owl in an ivy bush," said my aunt. "It's too terrifying. I'll go too." "But the child," I cried. "Suppose he wakes up?" "Oh, he won't stir. It's only 10 minutes or so. He's old enough to lie quiet if he does wake. He'll see the candles lighted." So we agreed to run down and see the ghost. The rain had ceased. Escorted by Robinson, who had a lantern, we soon reached the churchyard, which was close by, near the village side by the inn where the stream is. In the road and at the stile we found every living soul in the place. Outside the night was pitch dark. The great perpendicular tower was quite lost in the gloom. The trees tossed about and roared. The ivy fluttered and rustled in a most alarming way, and sure enough, inside there was a light, which moved about the chancel in the east window, which was half choked with ivy. But no one would venture near the doors, and we could not hear any sound but the terrible roaring of the wind and a banging noise at times. Suddenly the light went out, and we all jumped. Then, in the darkness and in the middle of the roaring of the storm wind, which seemed increasing, the sound of horses' hoofs was heard clattering down the hill. "It's the horse! The horse!" cried the women, and before you could wink, every man, woman, and child present took to their heels and ran for dear life to their houses, anywhere. They had all squeezed themselves into doorways and sheds like a general post in the nursery games in the manor in 1 minute. The clattering hoofs came nearer and nearer. I was squeezed into the inn door. I couldn't tell what had become of Aunt and the keeper. I wished my husband had been there, but it was no use wishing. The hoofs came down the hill faster and faster, banging fire out of the flints as we could see. The ghost rode right up to the road and stopped for a moment. Then he made up his mind and came towards the inn. The women pushed back and shut the door with a bang in its face. Now would it blast us with fire or come in through the door? We waited, shaking and quaking to see what would happen, and then we heard a noise and a loud kicking or thumping at the door. Nobody dared to move. Besides, it was after closing time. No one could be admitted. But the rider would not be denied. "Mr. Hawkin, I say! Hawkin, open the door. There's mischief about." "Aye," muttered Hawkin, "and it shall remain outside. Go your ways in peace," he said aloud. "Go on, go on." "Come, no nonsense," shouted the ghost, if it was a ghost, which I for one was beginning to doubt. "Open the door or I'll smash it. Don't you know me, George Syme?" "George? From the vicarage?" cried several. "Why, what brings you here this time of night?" "On horseback, too," said others. "Maybe it's only a device of the evil one," suggested the sexton. "I'd be careful if I was you, Mr. Hawkin." But a sounding kick and a few hard Cornish words settled the question, and Hawkin went to the door, expostulating loudly against violence and ghosts. "Ghosts be hanged!" exclaimed George as he strode into the passage, having slipped the bridle over a hasp in the wall. "What's all this mean?" "What's what mean?" asked Hawkin, who with us all was recovering his composure. The other people who had run away were gradually coming out like rabbits from their burrow after a shot was alarmed. "Why, all this about Master and Susan. The house is locked up, Master's away, and everyone's not at home. What's up?" "It's the vicar's ghost, George. It's in the church." "Nonsense," exclaimed the groom. "We've seen it," cried the audience. "Seen your grandmother," retorted the groom, who was perhaps nearer the truth than he knew or suspected. "Where's Master?" "Gone to London." "Who says so?" asked the man, turning on the speaker. "It's not true. He wouldn't go like that." "Young man," I said, pushing my way nearer, "I can tell you it is true. Mrs. Jacka, my aunt, and me went up to see her master this day, and that minx named Susan said he was packing up. Now you see why she and he have gone off." "Why, she was as good as promised to me," cried poor George. "Some of you guesses that." "Aye, George, we do," muttered some sympathetic voices. "We a'most knows it." "Well, there. Is it natural that she'd go and run away with my master, an honourable gentleman as ever stepped? No, there's something behind all this. It's the vicar's ghost, George. He came yesternight and let Comet loose, I suppose. Rubbish. But why she bolted or how, I couldn't make out, I must say." "She did bolt then, George?" "Aye, and opened the stable door in the bargain. I've been after her ever since daylight and found her in the Sadler farmyard off by Ferrybridge yonder. I'd been on her track for hours." "I wish Mr. Mulholland on Squire Drive was home. We could fix something then. What shall we do, Mr. Hawkin?" "Find out what's inside the vicarage, or in the church," said some sensible man in the crowd. "All very well, but we're incapable of it," said the groom. "Sides, Keys is in the vicar's study," remarked the sexton. "Drat that ghost, he should be laid by now. Listen to the wind, someone's busy tonight." "Hush, man, you can't tell who's listening. Let's up to the vicarage and go in if we can," said the sensible man again. "That's it," I cried. "Perhaps it's only a trick the vicar may be playing on you, playing ghost." "And Susan gone off?" "Not likely. But come you up to the parsonage. I think we may get in by the study window. Mr. Atkins, don't call it burglary now." "No," replied the sensible voice. "I'll not arrest you, George. Come along." Then I discovered that the constable, the only one for miles around, was the most sensible of all. Certainly we did find out queer things that night, as everyone suspected, Mr. Atkins of such gifts, he mostly being silent. The landlord, who, as the saying goes, could talk the hind leg off a donkey, was looked on as far the cleverest man and the most gifted. But he didn't hide his candles under a pewter in any way I could see. And the very idea of candles made me think of Charlie in the cottage asleep all alone. We better go up, I thought. Just then Aunt Martha came to me and said, "Why, here you are, Lucy. I'm going home." "Quite right, Aunt. It's dreadfully stormy," says I. "Will you find your way easy?" "Quite easy with the lantern," she said. "There's no ghost, I don't believe, and there is rheumatics. Don't be late, Lucy, now, but bring me the news." I promised to do so, and she toddled off with another woman who lived atop the hill. Then, being easier in my mind, I went with the crowd to the parsonage, and the groom, accompanied by the policeman to see fair play, put himself inside the study window by the light of lanterns, which flashed about like big fireflies, throwing queer shadows on the walls and making giants of small people, sprawling them out on the sides of the houses like imps. The constable handed the groom a light into the study, and then the window was shut down. In a moment or two, the candles were lighted within, and then George came into the hall with a light to open the door to the constable. "Now, you can't all be coming in," said he. "The vicar, he wouldn't like his house trampled on. Maybe he's inside the whole time, so stand back." The people didn't like this. They began to grumble. "Parson wouldn't mind," they said. "Well, then I won't have it," said the constable. "We'll have a few, Mr. Hawken here and Mr. Robinson, Mrs. Hawken and the lady yonder, who's a friend of the family from London, I understand." This was me. "We 6 will do all there is to be done and let you know, so keep quiet or I'll have you charged a truro." "6 is plenty, sir," we 4 said, feeling quite certain of our own share in the matter. "Plenty," assented the groom. "Now we're 4 men and 2 women. Let's divide and take a lady with each party. Who'll go upstairs and who'll go down?" His eyes happened to rest on mine, so I said, "Let us begin upstairs, and you try the basement." "Very well," he said. "I with Mr. Hawken and the missus will go below. Mr. Atkins with you, ma'am, and Mr. Richardson will begin at the top, and we'll meet in the drawing room yonder, upstairs when we've finished. Now quiet, please, all of you. Any news you'll hear quick enough." The people in the hall stood quiet, and as we ascended the staircase, we could hear the terrible howling of the wind, and fancied that we could distinguish the thunder of the waves beating on the rocky coast as the tide came in. It was a terrible night for the ghost. "That's Mr. Penlin's room," whispered the constable as we passed the door. "Shall we try it or go on?" he asked, holding up his candlestick. "Go on and work down," said Mr. Robinson. So we went on, and very soon examined the upper rooms. Susan's apartments were first visited. Very few things were visible in it. A dress hanging up behind the door, a trunk and some bandboxes, a pair of old boots and some other articles thrown anyhow on the bed and on the floor. Didn't look like the trim, tidy, pert maid we'd seen that morning. She'd evidently been hurried in her movements. "She's bolted, I should say," remarked the constable. "She's taken light things and left her box. What's in it, I wonder?" Clothing such as become a waiting woman, a few books and some letters, but the clothes were new and clean. A pair of boots attracted my attention. They were rather large. "A fine foot she had," I remarked as I took them up. "Why, what's these?" I stopped again and pulled from under her clean things a pair of trousers, checked pattern, which had evidently been worn a good deal. "This is a queer start," said the constable. "Let's turn out the jades box at once." We did so very quickly, and the rest of a suit of a male attire such as might be worn by a lad of 16 or so, a flash suit, the constable called it. "Well, so Miss Susan was fond of masquerading," said he, after inspecting the clothes. "Did anyone ever see her in boys' clothes, I wonder?" While he was pulling about the trunk, I opened the drawers in the dressing table and found a large quantity of fair, false hair nicely done up. In another place were combs and brushes, paste, rouge, and powders, and brushes like painters, camel's hair things, so you could alter her face as she pleased. "The hussy," I remarked. I saw at a glance that she was a bad one. I told my aunt so. "Look at these things, a regular painted Jezebel." The men were surprised, I can tell you. "Aye, she is a bad one," said the constable. "Suspect she has bolted with some valuables, not with Mr. Penelon at all. She's a thief." "Never," said Robinson. "The 2 was together, that's certain as sin. Come, you'll see further. Here's George and his party coming up." "What, George?" "Nothing particular. Plate chest locked all right. Cellar's locked too. Can't find the silver candlesticks, though, in the pantry. Bedroom pair, likely in the master's room." "Well, we found nothing upstairs but Susan's things, including a lovely head of hair," said Mr. Atkins. George Symes started. "A head of hair!" he exclaimed, staring at the speaker. "Aye, never mind now. Come into the vicar's room. Why, it's locked. There's no key." "Locked!" we exclaimed in a chorus. Then he must have gone, we thought. Everyone drew back and looked in turn at everywhere else. Leave it until we've searched elsewhere, said sensible Atkins. And if we find any more suspicious things or don't find something to satisfy us, then by George, I'll break the door. Where's the church's keys? In Parson's study, piped the sexton. They're hanging on a nail behind the press door. We all hurried into the study, but the keys were not there. Curiosity now was getting to a high pitch. We no longer minded the storm. "They keys is in the church door," squeaked the lad who just entered. "I felt him in the lock, I did." "You're a sensible idiot, Ben," cried the constable, putting on his hat. "Now then, lanterns, come along." We hurried out and went boldly enough into the churchyard and up the gloomy path between the graves of the dead. Graves of people who'd been drowned or cast ashore dead or who had died in their beds. Men mostly, as I had already seen. We reached the church porch, and as the lantern was held up to the lock of the old oak door, we perceived the key dangling from the keyhole. The door was locked, too. By this time, our fear of the ghosts had considerably subsided, and notwithstanding the howling of the storm and the gushing gusts of wind around the church, little hesitation was shown. Mr. Atkins was quite bold, and several of his immediate followers were brave enough. The hinder ones came in with the lights, being fearful to remain outside in the dismal darkness of the whirling wind. Mr. Atkins, leading the way and carrying a lantern, stepped up between the old carved pews on which scenes of scripture were engraved, with doves and eagles and coats of arms. He stood still near the front and called out loudly, "Is anyone here?" No one replied, except an echo in the chapel, so we shouted again. This time we heard a moan come from the east end, and a terrible chill struck me. I dare say others felt the same. We had shivers. It was a very weird feeling. The shadowy church, just light enough to make the darkness visible, the howling wind in the belfry overhead, the dangling ropes and the humming bells all united to make our flesh creep. And then the moan was so sad and weary. Keeping close together, the men in front, we straggled up the aisle and examined the chancel. No one was there except ourselves, but within the communion rails near the vestry door, lying prone on the floor, quite exhausted, was an elderly woman. "Why, it's Mrs. Mumbles," cried 2 or 3 of the spectators. "How did she come here?" "Never mind how she came. Let's get her out. The light is accounted for now," said George. The fainting woman was raised up and carried out to the inn, where she found voice enough to say, "Robbed, murdered, the master, the master." Some of us needed no more. Mr. Atkins rushed away, followed by Robinson, George, myself, and the Hawkins. We all guessed that the secret of Penelon's disappearance lay in the bedroom, which was locked. Robbery and murder are ugly words. A few well-directed blows stove the door in, and the men entered first with candles and lanterns. Sure enough, on the floor under the bed was the old vicar himself. Mr. Penelon dabbled in blood and apparently lifeless. The private safe was ransacked, the chest of drawers turned out. Many papers and some valuable articles were on the floor. Everything was topsy-turvy, but someone who knew the place had been there, for the secret drawers were forced open. By this time the ghost was entirely forgotten, and the doctor quickly fetched from his house about 3/4 of a mile away. He came, and having examined the poor vicar, concluded that he had had a severe blow on the head, but he would come round. The gentleman then went and prescribed for Mrs. Mumbles, and the people gradually dispersed. After relieving a nurse with the parson and George downstairs to see what was missing from the chests, which had been robbed and locked up again. Mr. Atkins stayed also, but I made my way home with Mr. Robinson and reached my aunt's cottage as the clock was whirring out 1. "Well," said Aunt Martha, "a pretty time in the morning to come home. And with Mr. Robinson, what's the matter?" Then I told her, and her face was a caution. "I knew it. I said so. The ghost did it. Is the vicar dead?" "Not yet," I replied, "but I'd have those 2 villains hanged if I had my way. A pair of ruffians, burglars, both wicked men as ever stepped." "What men do you mean, Lucy?" she asked. "Why, the men who robbed and nearly killed Mr. Penelon, Susan, and—" "You said men, Lucy." "And isn't Susan a man? Of course he is. A made-up young villain who bamboozled the old vicar and nearly canoodled George the groom. I saw through the paints and the false hair. Yes, I told you he was no good." "Let's get to bed," said Aunt Martha, who never could bear anyone to have praise. If she had found it, there would have been hot water and something for a late supper with chat before bedtime, I know. But there was no sign of it then. So we went to bed, tired out, and a little thirsty too. Next morning we were astir pretty early and in the village after a short breakfast. Everyone was chattering. Mrs. Mumbles had said something, but being short of teeth, and at the best of times, was indistinct. Being upset, no wonder. We made out that a man had called on the previous night, a red-faced man, and made some inquiries. He then must have gone round to the stables and loosed Comet, who had galloped up the avenue and over the hill. At any rate, the mare, being frightened, went off at a speed, and when he had thrown her out, the man must have left her and made his way back to the vicarage in the morning, early. With the assistance of Susan, he seized and stunned the vicar. Susan had previously locked old Mumbles in the church and said she was away on a holiday. This put people off. George was after the mare, Mumbles locked up, and the burglar, whom we took for a ghost, packed up all he could find with his friend's assistance. Susan had taken service there as a maid in order to better carry out the robbery, which yielded a quantity of plunder in silver plate, money, and objects of value, all which Miss Susan knew very well where to find, for the vicar was wealthy. These particulars came out by degrees, and meantime, while we were discussing the ghosts and the robbery, the previous appearances on the same day in former years, and their consequences, the men on horseback and on foot were searching roads and paths, sending flying telegrams all over the district, even launching boats when the weather moderated. We females also tried to find the runaways, and some of us at low tide investigated the caverns on the shore where in old times smugglers used to hide themselves and their plunder. In one of these great recesses, the burglar's plunder was found. Worse than that, the body of the pretty fair-skinned boy who had played parlour-maid and deceived even George Syme was discovered dead. He looked asleep, but was cold and stiff. The traces of seaweed and bits of driftwood beside and around him showed how he had died. The high spring tide had overwhelmed him in his sleep and drowned him. In the cave higher up was a bag, a heavy, small sack which contained most of the plunder. Of the other burglar we found no trace. Whether he had escaped or been carried off by the sea, no one ever knew, and I don't think anyone cared. But many of us were sorry for the lad, a pretty dark-haired boy about 16 with handsome features. As we saw him first on the beach with a dress skirt on over his other clothes, he looked like a pretty sleeping girl. Some women cried, and not a man said a word against him. The vicar would have buried him had he been well enough after the first inquest inquiry, but some other gentleman did. Found drowned was the verdict, and the handsome boy was put underground in a nameless grave. It was very sad indeed, and I'd rather not say any more about it. Some people came to the conclusion that the vicar's ghost was all nonsense, but it isn't. The ghost appeared long before the robbers made it an excuse for robbing the vicarage. We think the burglaries were done by the same man who, made bold by impunity, tried a big stroke at last. What became of him? We can't tell. Why he left the cave, we can only guess. Perhaps he meant to return and was prevented by the high tide, or swept away by the waves when trying. Or perhaps he fell down the rocks and was washed away. At any rate, we never heard of him again and don't want to hear. Mr. Penelon recovered, but could give little account of the incidents. Mrs. Mumbles told us how she found a piece of candle in the vestry, and walked about the church hoping someone would release her. She called out and beat the door, but we were all too frightened to go near the ghost, as we thought her. We had not a very merry Christmas after all these tragic events, but Aunt and I and little Charlie and his father, who came down, managed to enjoy ourselves. We left the village without hearing any more of the vicar's ghost on New Year's Eve, and I was not sorry to be home near Cardew Manor once again.
Miriam's Ghost by J.W. Hollingsworth. A Christmas Story. Captain Desmond leaned back in the open carriage with an unusual sense of enjoyment and relief. As his gaze took in spots of peculiar interest in the changing views of the country road, along which he was rapidly whirled to his destination, The close atmosphere of a first-class carriage of an express train from which he had emerged after a 4 hours' journey not half an hour since had left its usually cramped depression upon an active man used to open-air exposure, and he felt the rush and the wintry breeze upon his face with keen pleasure. After the conclusion of the Afghan War, in which Hugh Desmond had gained both honor and distinction for the great ability he had displayed in the execution of several difficult and arduous commissions, in which he was untiring watchfulness and marked bravery had placed his name in the forefront of those valued at the War Office, he had now arrived in England on leave of absence, after an unusually long period of service in India. The Desmonds were an old and extremely aristocratic family who traced their origin back to a time previous to the period of the Norman Conquest, and to whom the part of the country towards which he had been rapidly driven had formerly belonged up to the reign of Henry VIII, when the main portion of the Desmond family became open adherents of the Protestant cause and the Reformation. But during the conflict of the 2 succeeding reigns, the vast estates were lost to his family, and had been repeatedly bought and resold. The present owner, an extremely wealthy banker, being the grandson of the freeholder, the Maitland family had been bosom friends of his Desmond's father, and so, very soon after his return to England, he was a Christmas guest at the Girthford Manor, which is now visible from the acclivity he had reached on the road, and about a mile distant. A few minutes later, the road commenced to descend gradually, leading through a wooded district on both sides of the way, terminating at Guthford Park. Upon entering the gates, of which disclosed an avenue in a splendid forest of pine trees, which shortly after opened upon pasture land, with the ancient manor and priory in full view of the sunshine of the wintry afternoon. On Desmond's arrival at the mansion, a welcomed reception awaited him, and he was soon engaged in rapid conversation with his host and family. It wanted but 3 days to Christmas, and several guests were yet to arrive on a Christmas visit, and a large house party was arranged for the coming festival. The shadows deepened, and soon after the well-lighted and curtained room enhanced the comfort of the ruddy firelight, and the cheerful conversation was brought to a temporary close by his being compelled to retire to his room to dress for dinner. Less than an hour later, the family were seated to dinner. The head of the family, Mr. Maitland, was a well-preserved and handsome man, rather under 60. He himself had been an only son, and with the exception of the private fortunes of his 2 sisters, had inherited the manor and the adjoining estates, together with an immense fortune and successive interest in the large banking firm which his great-grandfather had founded. Thus born heir to a very large inheritance, he was a rich man, and had long since withdrawn from any active part in financial business of the banking firm. He married early, and had in family 2 sons, Horace and Gilbert, now aged 22 and 17, and 3 daughters, Frances, Emily, and Lucy. The elder sister was about 25 years of age. Her second sister was about 3 years younger, though rather fair and not quite so tall, yet bore a remarkable likeness to her. Lucy was a girl of 15. Mrs. Maitland was nearly 10 years younger than her husband. All without exception who have traveled for long in any far distant country, especially for years, realize in a most extraordinary manner the peculiarly happy sensation experienced upon retiring to their native home. Hugh Desmond loved his country with a wonderful devotion, and his enjoyment at this moment was that of transcendent character which baffles description. He was a brave, generous, and devoted man in disposition, whose only personal regard was his honor, and at 30 years of age he was a singularly handsome man and a perfect type of English gentleman. A sudden and new life was dawning upon him unconsciously this winter's afternoon and illuminating his soul with an intoxicating rosy light, and uniting him with that abode in the realms of happiness which is perhaps the most blissful. He was seated next to the mother of Frances Maitland, but his gaze unavoidably rested again upon Frances, who was in truth a very beautiful woman, Tall and lithe of stature, the exquisite proportions of her form and figures were enhanced by a deep blue velvet winter dress, the rich folds affording a vivid contrast to the creamy whiteness of her arms. Her rich, dark brown hair fell in a profusion of natural ringlets over her temples, and massing away from them over her head, and a drooping to the back of her neck. Her forehead was low and broad, her eyes deep, soft, clear brown, with delicately arched eyebrows and long droopy lashes, which looked almost black in their depth. Her nose was straight, with that finely chiseled arching at the nostrils, which is called spiritual. Her lips were exquisitely formed, with that upward turn at the corners called Cupid's brow, and denoting sweetness and amiability of temper, and which always indicates a noble self-sacrificing character. The expression which lent its peculiar charm to her very intelligent face was that of patient innocence. It was the happiest evening of his life, and later, when she sang for him, the sweet penetrating tones of her voice thrilled the depths of his soul, and, if it were, filled him with its melody. When a girl of little more than 16, he had loved her, and after her absence of nearly 10 years, that love awakened with a tenfold force. Her beauty had matured and developed into not only a glorious womanhood, but a powerful and exalted soul, the influence of which, once thoroughly established, was not to be forgotten, and especially by such a highly appreciative man as Hugh Desmond, whose heart throbbed faster at the kind of pressure of her hand ere he retired for the night. Christmas Eve brought with it not only a full house party for whom accommodation was arranged, but an unexpected lady guest as the last moment, whose comfort was a matter of consideration at a time when the family were alone. "I should not like to let her share a room or to go into an unused one," observed Mrs. Maitland to her husband. "Might I suggest," said Hugh, "that it would give me great pleasure if the lady could have my room, which is so very comfortable, and I should be quite safe and at the home in an unoccupied one, for I have been used for many years to far greater exposures to frequency inclemency in regards as my surroundings to have any fear of a damp room." "The difficulty is of another nature, Captain," replied Mrs. Maitland. "Though one of the best rooms in the house, it has been seldom used for years, for more than a night at a time. It has had a bad reputation," and a smile crossed his face as he uttered the words. "It is called the haunted room." Hugh's face lit up at the words. "The very adventure I have longed for as an experience for years. Pray gratify my wish now you have the chance, lest such an one might not occur again during my lifetime." And he added, "But I have no belief in apparitions, and I shall be disappointed if I do not go. Please let me have my own way." All, especially Frances Maitland, endeavoured to deter him, for a look of apprehension crossed her face, but he persisted the more in his wish, and broke into a merry peal of laughter. "Let me tell you," said Mrs. Maitland, "that it will be more difficult to introduce the servants to go there, and none of us ever do. It is kept locked, Captain." Remonstrance was in vain. Desmond's merriment was infectious, and amid the laughter he had provoked, he inquired if there was any legend attached to the haunted room, and who was the ghost. "It is said to be the ghost of the Miriam Desmond, who is one of the last of your known ancestors in England," was the reply. "She became a nun, and her 2 brothers went away. No one knew whether. She was called by the country folks the White Lady, and that she is at times seen as a firmly rooted superstition." "That clinches the matter," returned Hugh. "As long as I stay, please let me be there. I have a right to be with my ancestors, who could not possibly harm me, yet I may not hope for a visit from one of them." The bell was rung, and when the aged butler received his instructions to convey to the housekeeper, with orders to assist her as rapidly as possible for the captain's occupation, his pale, scared face told its own story. But he was a trusted servant and did not express his opinion. Fires were ordered to be lighted and kept going, with the windows open for occupation on the succeeding night, as the lady visitor would not arrive till the morning of Christmas Day. That Christmas morn dawned as the happiest Hugh Desmond had ever known, his very eyelids enclosed with a great wonderment and half self-questioning of its reality. But it was all real and true, and breakfast would again bring him into the presence of Francis Maitland. It was a brilliant winter's day, clear and sunshiny, and free from snow. The large house party gave the family the full complement of guests, and at the evening party were assembled a number of neighboring friends and children, which filled the spacious rooms, lighted and garlanded for the season's festivities, and as the evening wore on, the happy enjoyment seemed to deepen and gather greater happiness, as singing and dancing gave place to storytelling, and blind man's bluff and forfeits. The elderly lady visitor at the latter was the judge, and alike with others, the lips of Francis Maitland met those of Hugh beneath the mistletoe, and his heart bounded with rapture, and a rosy haze blinded his vision for the moment. Now and again the guests would seek the cool of the conservatory, and amidst the soft glow of the Chinese lanterns, Hugh and Francis stood by the rippling fountain, and drawing her to him, he kissed her head, saying, "I love you. You cannot tell how much I love you." And again their lips met in a long, loving kiss, and then arm in arm they sauntered back and joined again in the waltz and country dance till a late hour, and the younger guests began to depart. It was approaching the midnight hour before the family and friends separated for the night, and Hugh, in a whirl of happiness and joy, took away to his apartment. As he entered the haunted room for the first time and set his candle upon the table, and then closed the door after him, he then remembered his conversation regarding it with Mr. Maitland. It was a much larger apartment than the one he had vacated, being nearly or quite square, with high and in places carved and panelled oak wainscoting, polished and black with age. A cheerful fire blazed upon the hearth, and wide and heavy curtains overhung the window, which appeared so large that he was impelled to draw aside the folds, when he found that the extensive window, which attracted his notice, he was really 3 Gothic-shaped windows, the center one being the largest, with the curious diamond-shaped panes of glass with leaden glazing and latticed opening outwards. Hugh glanced at the fastenings of the windows. They were all secure, and then replaced the curtains. Then, walking to the fireplace, seated himself in the comfortable easy-chair and glanced round at the antique chamber with mingled wonder and admiration. For he could not but feel impressed with the solemn grandeur of the room, but equally he wondered at himself, for yet in a few minutes his sensations had unaccountably passed from the most joyous hilarity to a feeling of sad and sorrow regret, tempered with anxiety. The room was quite warm, perceptibly so, for the fire had been well kept up since the previous day. He felt no sign or chill or cold, yet the sudden transition was so great that an instant after he strove to ridicule himself for letting the remembrance of the legend weigh upon his spirits. Hugh shook himself, stooped down, took off his boots, and put on his slippers. Then, walking to the door, opened it, and put the boots outside. As he did so, a rush of joyous warmth seemed to pervade his being, and instinctively he stepped out with his slippered feet and stood alone in the silent, dark corridor. The change was remarkable, beyond description. His whole being thrilled with a great comfort. Then he turned, and re-entering the room, closed the door, and turning the handle of the key in the lock, felt the handle of the door. It was fast. Once more he felt though he had entered a tomb. He glanced at the very large, old, and handsome 4-post bedstead, and ejaculated mentally, "I shall soon get spoiled at this rate. Soft and easy quarters seem to be invariating. This is a proof of it." Rapidly preparing himself, he undressed, extinguished the light, and went to bed, feeling tired partly, but longing most for sleep till morning. He lay watching the flickering shadows cast by the slow declining firelight. He closed his eyes and sought repose, and tried to think of Francis, but it was with a sad, anxious feeling that he longed for the morning, and now and again he dozed. Then he fell asleep. He awoke with a slight start, as though some noise had awakened him, and turning, listened, but the most profound silence reigned. And then, thinking he must have started in his sleep, drowsiness was again stealing over him, when the distant church bell rang to strike. Arousing himself for a moment, he listened attentively, for the bell was tolling the warning for the hour. Then, with a few seconds' pause, came the solemn, deep-toned single stroke of 1 o'clock. Only one, he mused as he closed his eyes again. I could have slept for only a few minutes. I thought it later, and soon he slept profoundly once more. How long he slept, he could not tell, but again his slumber was broken in the same manner. He started awake, and feeling intense weariness, listened. Perfect, stilly silence reigned, and longing for sleep, he strove to quiet himself. Soon he fell in a half-sleep, and was again disturbed by a strange, hollow, and distant booming sound. Conjecturing that it might be an unclosed door, jarring with the draught, he nearly slept again, when the same sound was repeated, and notwithstanding his every effort to compose himself, for the desire for sleep became almost hungry with its intensity, he repeatedly awoke with the same sound occurring at intervals of 2 or 3 minutes. He asked himself what it could be, and whether in the house or far distant, or whether it was really a sound or noise or a deception of his senses. But the noise kept on. At the same short intervals of about 2 minutes came the weird boom, seeming to come from the depths of space and to strike upon the center of his being. And now a new feeling came over him, more prominent than the distant weird disturbance, an awful thirst for sleep. And he knew that he was fighting, and as it were almost struggling for repose. But strive as he might, there was no intermission. Then he ceased to feel it, and a feeling of relief mingled with dread came over him lest it should disturb him again. Once more he slept, but with his senses acutely strained even in sleep, when a new and shocking sound struck upon his ear, the awful sound, to a true man, of a woman's sob of intense suffering and sorrow. The deep, drawn, quivering sob of a woman in the extremity of anguish, weird, unearthly, distant, but yet still seeming to be within a few feet of Desmond. A sensitive chord of his soul had been aroused, and from its depths mingled sympathy, grief, and compassion welled up, and with it regret, for he could not think of no distant female who might be imagined to be in danger or suffering. But the desire for sleep became an agony, and closing his eyes again, he strove to drown his senses, and almost succeeded when the same detonation already described commenced again. It kept in the same way at the same intervals, and through prostrate with weariness, repose eluded him, and with each repetition his blood seemed to collide in its course, and he grasped for breath. It kept on. It grew insufferable. He could bear no more. Turning upon his back, he swept the hair from his heated forehead from his hand, and with his arms flung wide, gave up all hope of rest, and resolved to keep awake the rest of the night. Now that Desmond was fully awake, intense silence prevailed. His senses were undisturbed, yet he dreaded to sleep again. Then he remembered the strange reputation of the chamber in which he was, and he thought the coincidence remarkable, but resolved to make no mention of his impression on the morrow. A new impulse came over him to get up and dress himself, and give up all prospect of sleep that night. He arose, struck a match, and lit his candle, and looked at his watch. It was 20 minutes past 2 o'clock. He dressed himself completely, put on his slippers, and seated himself in the easy-chair, and leant back, gazing at the last expiring glow of the hollows left of the dying fire. And though his limbs almost ached with weariness, and he longed for rest, he yet felt glad he had risen, and the reflection struck him that in an hour or at most the candle would be burnt out, and he would be in the dark. He got up, walked softly to the window, and drew aside one of the curtains. It was a brilliant moonlight. He flung the curtains wide till the 3 large windows were bare, and the room was flooded with moonlight. Then he walked to the table and extinguished the candle, and the room seemed lighter than before. And he reseated himself as he leant back in his chair. He grew more composed, pacified almost, but for the feeling of compassionate regret at the memory of the sound of that sob. Perhaps half an hour passed. It seemed so long, and he grew chilly. He resolved to lie down again at least. It would be warmer. His large fur-lined railway and driving rug hung over a chair back, and he lay down, spread it wide over him, drew it beneath his feet by raising them, and in a few moments he was quite warm. He rested, looking at the moonlight. Then he dozed and opened his eyes again, looking at the window, and then he dozed again. Then he slept. How long he slept he knew not, but when he was aroused by something very gently touching his wrist, he opened his eyes, at first drowsily. Then his orbits expanded to their fullest limit, and his blood seemed to grow cold. He could not utter a sound. His tongue became as rigid as his fixed gaze and motionless limbs. He was no longer alone. Close to his bedside, and in the full flood of the clear moonlight, with her hand outstretched to him in an attitude of supplication, was the figure of a small lady clad in white from head to toe. Captain Hugh Desmond was a very brave man, an admirable soldier, regarding his utter fearlessness of death, added to his love of danger and perilous adventure, but never thought his military career he had experienced the sensation of appalling dread, which for the first few minutes overcame him at the meeting between the unearthly and the unearthly. But the spasm of horror was only for a few moments. The wraith was only that of a small and delicate woman. But of a supplicant, compassion rose within him, and determination to aid her, to the best of his ability, gave him back the use of his limbs. He rose upon his elbow, slowly at first disengaged his limbs from the folds of the rug, and regained his feet, stood before her. Her face, raised as it was appealingly, scarcely reached the level of his breast, and he stood by her side awaiting her will and wish. She stretched out her hand to him, her hand which he took in his right. The touch was perceptibly hard. The bones of the tiny hand were fleshless, and the slender finger joints were rigidly straight and drawn together as in the attitude of death. And as he gently took that fleshless hand in his, he noticed that the finely pointed bones of the fore and middle fingers were broken and absent. With that touch, all was changed. No need was there for words or human language. Desmond knew from that moment to moment her will, wish, motive, and the longing to transmit her memories, records of the past. Holding her by her fleshless hand, he walked by her side to the door which she unlocked and threw open for her to pass. She guided him out into the dark corridor by that hand he constantly held, along through the black darkness. Dark no longer now, for with them went a new and strange light. More like the light of day than the moonlight they had. Onward she led him across the corridor, down a short corridor to the right, then a little way down a parallel corridor to the left, and across it to the heavy black oak-paneled woodwork. She paused at one of the dark alcoves, by her wish, and he knew what to do. He pressed a mound of heavy carving at the side, and the back of the recess gave way on its hinges. They passed through the secret doorway, the same light going with them as they passed on noiselessly, but for the almost inaudible sound of Desmond's slippered feet to the head of some wooden stairs, by means of which they descended to a stone passage with a window in it, similar to the diamond glazing to the one of the chamber he had left, but that was the recess of several feet in depth. He was enclosed by a grating of iron bars of vast strength let into the solid stonework. Crossing the vault, they approached a partition of heavy wooden planks resembling the corner of a storeroom. A wooden door was ajar. Desmond put forth his hand and drew it open. It was a double partition door, and the corner angle swung open at the touch, and its double hinges revolved. They entered the vault through the wide corner opening. It was filled with the same light that seemed to form part of them, and they stood contemplating a weird and awful sight in which they met his view. There they were. They were large, rough wooden shelves in front, and to the right, and on those shelves sideways, in the repose of death or sleep, lay two human skeletons, where to all appearance they had been for centuries. Long he gazed in pain and sorrow at the awful spectacle as he still held her by her hand. Then he turned and looked upon her upturned face in its silent appeal, with deep sorrowful compassion and regret. He felt so sorry for her and her awful life, suffering, and death. The same transmitted power of memory revealed all as she stood by him, the garments of the white nun alone concealing the fleshless form which was beneath, and the white hood concealing all but the wide, vacant orbits of the face of death, upturned toward him in appeal. He understood all then. The record of an awful crime, an unknown murderer, through which she, the innocent one, suffered, and that which was buried beneath her feet, which belonged by right of birth to her and to her heirs of Desmond, and now to him, last of the race of the line direct. He felt all the gratitude he owed to his wrongful ancestress through all of the centuries of the past, but above all, he felt that the deep, unfathomable sorrow and regret that is helpless and utterly unavailing. Desmond turned away gently and slowed. He led his ghost companion back the way they came. They reascended the wooden staircase. At his touch, the great oak slab resumed its place, and she led him to his chamber door, and once more, with that awful face upturned to his, in the appeal for compassion, she slowly withdrew her hand from his in silent farewell, and gave the adieu that would only be broken in the vista of eternity, when all see us as they are seen. The visitor passed away, and with her faded the guiding light. Desmond turned, and entering the room, closed the door, and, lighting his candle, threw himself upon his knees by the bedside, and prayed as he never had prayed before for the peace and rest of the unhappy soul he had bidden farewell to. Then he threw himself upon the bed, and he, the strong man, burst into an agony of weeping, and sobbed like a child till his pillow was wet with tears. With this paroxysm of grief came relief. He was calmer, but exhausted, and he closed his eyes to avoid seeing the great wheel rays caused by the candlelight upon his humid eyes. Greater quietude stole over him till his thoughts wandered, and he forgot all in a deep slumber, which lasted till the butler knocking at his door awoke him at 8 o'clock, and he sat up and called out, "Thank you." Desmond's head ached slightly, but he felt refreshed, and thought that he must have slept for 3 hours at least, as the memory of that terrible night's adventure crowded in upon his waking thoughts, for his pillow was still damp. The candle must have burnt out, he said to himself, as he got upon his feet and approached the table. But he looked in blank astonishment when he perceived the extinguisher upon the candle as he left it, when he lay down for the second time. For when the white nun parted from him, he had only closed but not locked the door. With 3 or 4 hasty strides he crossed the door and turned the handle. It was locked as he had left it. When he placed his boots outside the night before, "By Jove," he exclaimed aloud in bewilderment, "it must have been. It actually was a dream after all. But what a vision! I thought it real to this moment." His toilet was completed before the breakfast bell sounded, and he went down to the breakfast room as it ceased ringing. Francis and Mr. Maitland were in the dining room when he entered, and their warm greeting was accompanied by Mr. Maitland exclaiming, "Why, Desmond, you look as though you have seen a ghost." "I certainly had a wonderful dream of a white nun," he replied, relating the substance of what had been recorded. The recital formed the topic of conversation till its minutest details were ended. There are several people living who describe the White Lady exactly as you do, observed Mr. Maitland, but your account of the night walk with her was something truly new and extraordinary about it, and if you like, presently we will visit the place you speak of. You'll be able to guide us. Hugh acquiesced, and soon after the table was cleared, all but Mrs. Maitland accompanied him upstairs to his room from the door in which he led them to the next corridor to the right, which, unlike his story, terminated at the end of a solid wall, which at once he observed. But where, questioned Mr. Maitland, was this parallel corridor you speak of? Right here, replied Hugh, placing his hands upon the solid wall. But there is no corridor, nor even woodwork here. Well, this is the marvelous part of your vision, Desmond. Behind this wall is a corridor strongly resembling what you describe, rejoined his host, and some 25 years ago, owing to the dampness of the old unused building at the same time that improvements were being carried out, I had a complete separating wall built up from the basement to the roof at this juncture at great expense, but if you like we can enter it from the priory ground. With keenly excited interest, all at once agreed, and in a few minutes were dressed for the short walk around to the old priory garden. Horace procured a lighted lantern from the head gardener, which he carried with him, together with the keys, and in a few minutes were not only inside the ancient building, but ascending to the upper part which brought them back to the manor side, and in a few minutes they entered the gallery. As they did so, Hugh Desmond uttered an exclamation of amazement. "This is the corridor," he cried. "Wait a minute." Then, when they had nearly reached the other end on the right-hand side, where all of the massive black oak woodwork was intact, he said, "This is the place," laying his hand upon a raised goblin face, and one in which the broad buttress posts of the alcoves. "I know from the distance from the window, but it is solid. It will not yield." "This is wonderful," mused Mr. Maitland, "and you were never here nor heard of it before." "Never," returned Captain Desmond. Meanwhile, Horace had taken out his pocket knife, and opening the blade, stooped down to the floor and probed with the long point of all the recess, with Hugh at his side, but the point struck solid wood. Then he tried the one indicated by Hugh, on which he uttered a cry of alarm. The blade repeatedly penetrated like under a door. Then he worked away till it passed from post to post. "See, it will go in under like a door," he said, and then he tried next. It was solid, like the first, and so were all the others. Yet on close examination, the recess seemed as solid as all the rest. The goblin head was pressed with force, but without result. "Wait, and I will get a hammer," cried Horace, and he went off to the gardener's house. In a few minutes he returned with a large hammer, a branch log about 18 inches long, and a sack. The sack was folded and laid against the curved goblin face. The billet was held with both hands, while Mr. Maitland struck careful heavy blows upon the reverse end, using it as a ram. "It is giving," exclaimed Gilbert as he felt it, and examination proved the truth of this. The prominent circle surrounding the face was going in. Several more heavy blows sent it in further, and then at 4 more it went in suddenly, giving way with a clash and clinkle rattle at the back of the woodwork, which quivered at the side. The goblin face was driven into the hole, and the shock had apparently loosened the seemingly solid background. Then Hugh and Horace pressed carefully against this, and by degrees it yielded a groaning, rasping noise, as it was the last massive rusted iron hinges gave way, and the secret door stood wide open, revealing to Captain Desmond's unutterable astonishment the landing and wooden staircase of his dream of last night, and he recoiled as he trod on something snake-like buried in the accumulated dust of centuries. On examination, it proved to be a loose piece of rope, but so old and decayed that it fell apart in pieces when lifted up with a hand. At the side of the stairway lay a large loose beam, as by the aid of the lantern they carefully descended the stairs. A dank and noisome odor from the vault, smelling of a damp and decay, assailed their nostrils. and Hugh Desmond instinctively held out his hand for the lantern, which in the dark blackness, for caution, he held near the ground. The dust of centuries, cobwebs, and decay were visible at every step. 20 yards further, the wide passage terminated in several divided cellars, as they afterwards found. But Hugh crossed this first vault in the direction of some woodwork, and then exclaimed, "Here are some bars, and exactly such as you described, except the window," said Horace. "The recess is identical with the description," said Mr. Maitland, "and the window is likely to be at the end, though perhaps buried." They commenced to examine the woodwork, which formed an angle with the next vault. Hugh passed the lantern up and down each right angle, and they found only perceptible aperture near the first corner, but it would not yield to the other hand. Gilbert went back and brought the hammer and log of wood. They first used the hammer handle, and then inserted the log. A few blows widened the opening sufficiently for two to get double hold and force it open. The heavy planking jarred that vibrated with their effort, and gave way with a crash. Mr. Maitland stepped hurriedly on one side as the whole corner fell over with a great noise. It was a double-awning door which had been broken off the hinges, which were rusted away, and as they all perceived the wonderful coincidence, they shrank away from the wide entrance and conversed in low hushed tones, whilst the girls kept close to their father. "Let us view the inside," said Mr. Maitland. Thus admonished, Captain Desmond, holding the lantern before him, led the way. The interior appeared like long unused spare vault, with wide shelves at right angles at the side and back, and all with Hugh Desmond at one and the same time uttered a cry of horror, for on the raised shelves, encrusted and black with decay and mildew and the dust of centuries, lay unmistakably the remains of bones falling apart and separated in places, but all that was left of what had certainly been two human beings. At last Captain Desmond spoke, and addressing Mr. Maitland in a broken voice, articulated the words, "It is all true, the legend," and glancing at their pale faces, added, "I have without doubt seen the ghost of Marian Desmond." "A real vision, Hugh, without a doubt. But what of that which is buried? Where is that? That which was once hers and now yours?" "I cannot recall," replied Hugh, but advancing and touching the ground with his foot. "This is the place." "But what are these again?" asked Mr. Maitland, indicating the human remains. "I cannot recall," at length said Hugh, "but I believe they are the evidences of or connected with some unknown crime, and I fear she was the victim. I am sorry, for last night I felt I knew it all." "Hugh, my dear boy," said Mr. Late Maitland, "listen to me. I firmly believe this is in the hand of Providence. I do not doubt that treasure lies buried here, and I tell you, I am certain it belongs to you, and you alone by right, and that these are the remains of the lost Desmonds. Whatever lies buried here shall be yours. I will see the vicar of the Girthford this afternoon, and so search all the records we can find." "Thank you, sir," returned Hugh Desmond absently. "I cannot describe the grief I feel for my ill-fated kinswoman of past ages, and possibly her brothers. May heaven give rest to her soul." "Amen," said Mr. Maitland. After having seen that the building was closed, Mr. Maitland took the keys back with him to his study and directed the members of his family to make no further mention of the incidents of the morning, as the account would cause vulgar excitement and do no good. The vicar returned to lunch with Mr. Maitland, visited the remains with him, and decided they had better be reverently closed and interred in the old burial ground of the priory, and an order was sent to the neighboring town for a suitable casket of the requisite dimensions, and in a very few days this was carried out, and the vicar and Dr. Thornhurst, who obtained special aid from London, compiled careful records of all the circumstantial evidences. The next day, after the interment in company with Hugh Desmond and Dr. Thornhurst, Mr. Maitland returned to the secret vault, where a man sent for the occasion commenced to dig. At the depth of a few feet beneath the brickwork, they came upon stones carefully laid in order beneath which, buried in dry sand and enclosed in stones beneath, and all around as above, in wonderful preservation, a strong, heavy oak chest, and nothing more. It was heavy and was conveyed to Hugh's room, the haunted chamber where he still preferred to sleep, for since Christmas night his rest had been peaceful and unbroken. The ground was filled in, the secret door was repaired with the new hinges, and a lock, for forcing it open, the ancient mechanism was broken, being rusty and decayed. The whole being carried out under the supervision of an expert from London, skilled in investigation. The oak chest was forced open by Hugh in the presence of Mr. Maitland and his sons the next day. It was found to contain an iron box. This in turn had to be forced and contained, wrapped in a piece of work tapestry about 3 yards square, which had been used as a wrapper, and when carefully unwound, disclosed a large carved ebony casket with ring handles of the same wood in almost perfect preservation. To one of the handles a key was attached by strong worsted thread, and upon being cut off and used, after several attempts with the aid of oil, at last turned the lock and the lid open readily. Upon the top of its contents lay 3 folded parchments, the first bearing the date September 29th, 1553, and written in the quaint old English of the time, but quite legible, ran as follows: I, Miriam Desmond, being about to take the veil for forsake the world, give and bequeath to my dear brothers John and Henry Desmond, and to their heirs forever as a family inheritance, my necklace and bracelet, jewels and tiara of diamonds, which I inherited at the death of my dear mother, to keep or use and dispose of as they may deem fit, for their own welfare, they being peril, and may heaven preserve them. Miriam Desmond. The next. The last will and testament of John and Henry Desmond. Girthford Manor, November 17th, 1553. I, John Desmond, being of sound and disposing mind, and in the first place sole heir of the Desmond estates, together with, and in mutual agreement with, my own brother Henry Desmond in the second place, we, the said John Desmond and Harry Desmond, have agreed for purposes of security to secrete and bury the Desmond coronet and jewels, and the tiara of the jewels of my only sister Miriam, together with the deed of her gift to us, also herewith in addition the title deed of the Desmond estates, the motive being that we deem our lives and property in peril of forfeiture from religious and political enemies, we being Protestants. For this reason we have decided to leave our native country for safety. But as sons of the race of Desmond, we cannot be dishonest into our trust, or wrong our posterity of this inheritance by sale or disposal, and so have mutually buried the casket containing these jewels here, where they may be preserved by secrecy for the possession of our true heirs in the future. And in safety the secret of this hiding place will remain with me alone, to be handed down even from father to son hereafter, signed by each in each other's presence, John Desmond, Henry Desmond. The third parchment was an exceedingly ancient title deed in Latin Old English of the Desmond lands and the property of the 10th century. These were carefully laid aside, and the coronet, tiara, bracelets, necklace, rings, and orders, which were packed with extraordinary care in pieces of parchment and woven linen, were next opened to view by Hugh Desmond amidst expressions of wonder and admiration, mingled with regret at their beauty and enormous value. Diamonds, sapphires, rubies, and emeralds glittered in rival brilliancy, and many of these precious stones were of great size. After some conversation had passed, Mr. Maitland at length asked Hugh what he should do with the great fortune he had thus possessed. Strictly carry out the intentions of the testators, replied Hugh. A resolution worthy of a Desmond, returned Mr. Maitland, and may this great fortune bring you equal happiness. When valued, the contents of the ebony casket were estimated by experts to be worth nearly £200,000. Hugh Desmond's visit to Girthford was greatly prolonged, during which careful investigations were made, and the specialists from the investigations department arrived at the conclusion that the remains of the 2 humans being found were those of the Desmond brothers, one of whom was married and left 3 children. These 2 brothers were supposed to have been murdered, as they were never heard of after the year 1554. From the examination, it was deemed likely that the mechanism of the secret door, which was evidently moved in order to open the secret panel from the inside by the aid of a rope hanging above, and which had probably given way and imprisoned them alive, and the vast strength of the oak door had resisted every effort to escape. The beam found on the stairs was thought to have been used in an attempt to break it open, but in vain. The fate of Miriam Desmond is unknown. The wife of Henry Desmond had taken refuge in Holland or Germany with her children, and his descendants returned to England in 1593 during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. One sunshiny autumn day in the succeeding year, Captain Desmond stood at the communal fall rails with Francis Maitland in Garthford Church, where they were united in marriage, and for many years enjoyed great happiness. They were blessed with a family of both sons and daughters. Under the dispensations made during his lifetime, subject to the discharge of certain conditions, they were fulfilled after his death. The whole of the Desmond estates, together with the freehold, forever reverted to Captain Hugh Desmond, and his children inherited their rights. The story of the haunted chamber is to this day a family legend, but Miriam's ghost was never seen or heard from that Christmas night of Hugh Desmond's vision. The end.
Well, that was an awesome story.
It is. It's a very good story.
Just in case anyone's interested, while Jason was reading that, I was Googling the actual cost of what those would be worth now. Are you ready? 11,900,000 pounds.
That's really cool.
Like pounds as in
yes,
money. And I also learned that what I want more than anything in the whole wide world is a car and train fur-lined rug like the guy had in the story.
That's pretty cool.
That's pretty cool. But yeah, you did good.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. We hope everyone enjoyed it, and we want to thank you guys so much.
Yes.
For sticking with us, being with us. Thanks to our patrons. Thanks to all the people who support us and write reviews and tell their friends, and we're just really grateful. So Merry Christmas to everyone.
Yes.
Merry Christmas. Hopefully,
Happy New Year.
Hopefully you're haunted by only the nicest Christmas ghosts. So thanks, guys. We want to thank you. And remember, if you're looking for a podcast that has the actual ghost story with the actual history
in the actual place,
then you know where to find it.
Yeah.
Take care. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.